Why we haven't seen EV adoption come up in the accelerated way that we've seen in other markets.
Traditional issues that we see with EV adoption is the fact that there is so many unanswered questions or half-answered questions when it comes to fueling EVs. Right?
Today we're talking about EV. So how will those metrics or those challenges be different this time with EVs compared to ICE?
See, one of the biggest challenges in fleet when you run it, whether it's ICE or EV, is fundamentally that when we say downtime, when we say repairs, when we say maintenance,
How businesses are evolving so fast. Welcome to Driven, the Advantage podcast where we deep dive into ideas, innovations, and individuals who are creating the future of mobility, electric vehicles, energy startups in India. Today, I am very happy to tell you that I've been joined by somebody I've known for many years, Sandeep Divakaran. And before we get into and asking questions, I'm going to let Sandeep give a brief introduction so that we know who and what his background is and how he spent most of his life in trying to promote mobility solutions. And now he's focusing on trying to see and accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles across commercial form factors. Sandeep, welcome to Driven.
Thanks, Kunal. Hi, everyone. I am Sandeep. Been about kind of 25 years of experience, the intersection of financing, leasing, and mobility. Started my career as founding a leasing company which was focused on technology assets for many years. Moved to one of the largest mobility startups in the country to kind of build a very impactful fleet leasing company for them, and then later on moved on to create a electric mobility platform. Post that, did a stint at creating a new NBFC which was focused on consumer lending on the electric vehicle space and financing electric two-wheelers. Now associated and starting a new venture in partnership with Exponent Energy and yourself in building something very impactful on the accelerating of mobility and mobility finance perspective.
Great. Okay, thank you. Being very humble. Said large mobility. You actually meant Ola. So I don't know why you didn't mention that. But anyways, so let's start and talk a little bit about your entire journey. So you spent 25 years now almost across asset management, fleets, and EV financing. So looking back now, tell me what is that recurring friction point that you kept seeing across the adoption? And according to you, what was that number one reason why we haven't seen EV adoption come up in the accelerated way that we've seen in other markets?
Fundamentally, Kunal, when you talk about mobility, whether it's personal mobility, whether it's commercial mobility, whether it's people or moving cargo, the fundamental requirement is that the vehicle needs to move from one place to another, and for that you need to fuel the vehicle, right? And the traditional issues that we see with EV adoption is the fact that there is so many unanswered questions or half-answered questions when it comes to fueling EVs, right? Like when we go and buy a ICE vehicle, we don't ask the dealership as to how do you fuel your vehicle or what is the fuel tank capacity and so on and so forth. But we end up asking about 10 questions before we even decide to buy an EV. And that's like, what is the battery capacity? What is the range? How long does it take to charge? Where do I charge? How do I charge? How long does the battery last? So there's at least 6 questions that you need answers. And 9 out of 10 times you don't get a satisfactory answer, right? So until the energy question is answered in its entirety, smooth adoption of EV will not necessarily happen, right? And that's one of the reasons why EV adoption has had significant friction, because if fueling the vehicle has so many questions, then smooth adoption is almost impossible.
Right. So we've gone from deti kitna hai in ICE vehicles to chalti kitna hai in EVs. Great. So as the CEO of Ola Fleet, you operated at massive scale, right? It's an asset-heavy business. I can only imagine how complex and challenging that was. So what that experience, what is it that you learned about unit economics, uptime, and capital efficiencies in running an asset-heavy business? And Ola Fleet was at that time was all ICE.
Yeah.
Today we're talking about EV. So how will those metrics or those challenges be different this time with EVs? compared to ICE?
See, one of the biggest challenges in fleet when you run it, whether it's ICE or EV, is fundamentally that when we say downtime, when we say repairs, when we say maintenance, it is construed to be a cost structure item, right? It's considered a cost element, right? How much do you spend for maintaining a vehicle, maintaining a machine? But in mobility, what happens is it's actually directly translates downtime directly translates to missing revenue, right? Which means it's not a cost structure anymore. It's actually revenue missed, right? And hence, ability to predict maintenance schedules, ability to predict breakdowns becomes a very important aspect of how you run a fleet at scale, so to say. With ICE, it was almost impossible. We used to put multiple devices on the vehicles. We used to even collaborate with some of the OEMs to get error codes and so on and so forth. But it was almost impossible for us to kind of predict in a predictive manner when the vehicle will break down for what reason, right? And with EVs, if it's built well, that kind of an issue gets sorted to a great extent because it's a connected vehicle. Most of the powertrain components are fully connected. You understand, like the two core components, which is the motor and the battery, are connected and are kind of controlled to control units, whether it's a motor controller unit or the battery management systems, and you're able to understand any significant failure modes or any significant potential failure modes that happens beforehand, and thereby rectify some of the issues that you see in the fleet, so to say. Having said that, I mentioned the word if it is well built. So, well, how well is the battery built, how well the powertrain is built is also equally important for EVs to succeed in fleets.
Great. Great. So you went from building an ICE fleet at massive scale to then with EV setting up an EV financing, captive financing arm for an OEM. Just I'm sure at that time you realized that the traditional financing norms and criterias that banks and NBFCs used to typically deploy and are great at with regards to financing ICE is very different when it comes to financing EV. So just walk us and through how different are these two norms. In fact, how important is the asset class itself that is fundamentally changing the way we finance these vehicles?
Kunal, you're right. So fundamentally, there's always been a reluctance among traditional financiers to lend to electric vehicles. To an extent, in personal mobility, especially on two-wheelers, it is kind of sorted because the ticket sizes of those loans end up becoming almost like a personal loan. So they run on purely credit kind of capabilities and credit rails, so to say, and not necessarily as asset-backed funding. But if you look at it from overall acceptance or overall ability of traditional financiers to underwrite EVs, it is substantially lower. But having said that, the EVs from a capex perspective is costlier than the ICE vehicles. Hence, financing becomes almost important for it to grow, so to say, and hence financing becomes the core. And the delta in cost significantly is contributed by batteries, and batteries essentially is an asset class that financiers traditionally don't understand, and hence it becomes difficult for them to create structures that enable the TCO to be something comparable for a individual, because in personal mobilities the runs are not as high, and hence your cost structures actually don't play out the way it is technically supposed to play, because you end up paying for battery costs which you don't use as much, right? And hence EVs tend to become costlier from a use case perspective in personal mobility. So in when I started EVFin, I was essentially focused on not just captive business but financing two wheelers. The focus was on creating a used vehicle market for electric two wheelers, and thereby kind of defray some part of the battery cost that the individual doesn't end up using into a secondary life of sorts, and thereby bring down the TCO in some form or shape. Now, that is where the understanding of battery, powertrains, and the ability to understand the exact use of the battery, the rest of useful life of the battery, and all comes into play from financing perspective. That makes EV viable for even personal mobility, where the number of kilometers a vehicle runs is substantially lower.
Great. So that was a great foundation, and now the season being announced, and we're super excited to work with you on Exponent One. I love the name One. It's a whole chakra of financing. But what was the fundamental thesis behind Exponent One? And of course, as an investor, we sort of fully support that vision that you're executing. Given your experience on with Ola and with EVFin, At what point did it become absolutely clear that for EV financing to scale successfully and profitably, that energy, infrastructure, and finance need to be solved together rather than in silos? I'd love to get your point of view on that thesis.
Yeah. So, Kunal, while somewhere in 2021, I had set out to say that accelerating adoption of EV electric vehicles in the country is one of my life's goals in the rest of my career, so to say. I was kind of solving for adoption in various categories as the adoption happened. So, in India, adoption started with two wheelers, so started with the two wheeler financing kind of a business, but it was always understood that bulk of the significant number of kilometers run and the energy consumed in the country would be by commercial vehicles. The biggest factor that influenced my decisions as I went into this EV financing journey over the last 5 years has been the fact that in commercial vehicles, the run of these vehicles are significantly higher. The load factors, the amount of rigor that the vehicles go through is significantly higher compared to personal use case. And hence, you need to have very robust batteries and powertrain systems that will enable these vehicles to withstand the kind of usage that they do. And this essentially becomes the cornerstone of how you do financing or underwriting in the commercial vehicle space. In commercial vehicle space, there are only three truths, really, right? You can do as much as underwriting, as much of analytics as possible. There are only three truths, right? The market needs to have enough business, the vehicle needs to run all the time, and the driver needs to know how to do business. These are only real three truths for financing in commercial vehicle space. Till hitherto, about till 2 years back, I wasn't convinced there was any powertrain worth its this thing in the electrical commercial vehicle space that would withstand the number two criteria, which is the vehicle should have minimal downtime and maximum possible range as possible, right? And that's been the reason why I stayed away from commercial vehicles. But with Exponent Energy providing 15-minute charging and a very robust battery and powertrain system because of the controlled charging environment they work in, that kind of has been solved where the longevity of these vehicles, as kind of evidenced by the warranties that Exponent gives, and also the unlimited range that it potentially gives because of its 15-minute charging experience, kind of solves the two fundamental issues that electric commercial vehicle mobility kind of faced all this while, right? And now what happens is the vehicle has significantly better uptime, the driver can ride as much as he wants, and number three, the warranty and the way the engineering is done makes the powertrain and the battery very robust, and that helps us take away most of the risk that happens within the commercial mobility space. Hence, I'm super excited in building Exponent One in partnership with Exponent Energy. And with you coming in as an investor, it kind of helps me kind of get a real perspective from an automotive perspective as well. And that's how we are set out on this journey.
Great. Okay. Talk a little bit about the future. You've been an operator, and now you've sort of now starting to build Exponent One, which is in the intersection of EVs, energy, and finance. What's that one lesson, given your experience and your journey, that you believe will matter more uh, over the next decade, uh, especially given the whole AI hype cycle that we are in? So, in other words, how businesses are evolving so fast, right? There are the traditional forms of financing, traditional ways in which EV adoption has happened. Now you layer this whole AI element to that. So, walk us through how you feel that this industry, this sector, is going to fundamentally change going forward by layering this element or leveraging what AI capability can bring to the table.
Yeah. So, Kunal, fundamentally, we'll keep the AI question for the second part. But fundamentally, the learnings from all these years of running mobility fleets and mobility companies and financing companies per se has been that the single biggest truth is if your customer doesn't succeed, you don't succeed, which is means your customer fails, you fail. Right? There is no magic wand a fleet company or a financing company or an OEM or energy company can do where their customer fails and you would succeed. So end of the day, all systems, all ecosystem, everything that you build has to focus on how does your customer succeed. And success in this case to a great extent means actually livelihoods, right? And how are they able to consistently meet their livelihoods? How are they able to meet their aspirational needs and so on and so forth, right? And financial inclusion in its essence is what happens when you do these. And because a significant portion of mobility assets are traditionally owned by driver come owners and small fleet operators, and not necessarily through large fleets, so to say. And it's been across the world mostly, right? Fleets have been very few between, and successful fleets have been even less, so to say, in that sense, right? So when you look at it from that perspective, it is very important to understand that your financing systems, your energy ecosystem, everything has to come together, understanding the needs of the mobility owner or the driver come owner, understanding the cash flows of the driver come owner, understand his working patterns, understand the number of hours, number of days he works, and so on and so forth. And your systems, including financing, has to cater to that, and not the traditional way in which personal finance has been extended to commercial vehicle finance, where you have monthly EMIs and tenures and LTVs and so on and so forth. A significant portion of underwriting is based on credit rails, which has no meaning in the mobility space. Right. Because a driver has multiple needs, they tend to take small loans, they tend to not have the greatest of bureau scores. So there's only so much you can underwrite, so to say, right? Which essentially means that the underwriting is purely focused on two fundamental things, like I said before: the ability for him to generate enough income, the ability for the vehicle to run as much as it with limited downtime, so to say. So when you do this, and when you need to adapt to his cash flows, and it can be day to day, it can be week to week, it can be month to month, and so on and so forth, it becomes very important for the finance companies and financial fintech companies to be able to understand these requirements on a very adaptive manner, on a very live basis, so to say, and adjust their systems, their collections, their EMIs, their rentals, their daily collections, everything to the vagaries of what a commercial vehicle driver goes through. And when you need to do that at scale, that is when generative AI and AI comes into picture. Because if you want to be as adaptive and as customized as the daily rigors of a driver, you can't do it manually. You can't have 10,000 people looking at each and every driver and so on and so forth. You can't have rules written for 10,000 kind of different use cases. You need the AI to be able to tell you from a machine learning perspective as to what does it work, what does each of the indicators of the driver tell you, saying what would be his earnings for the day, how to be his earnings for the week, and so on and so forth, and adapt your collections and your other underwriting processes based on that. Also look at the signals that are coming from both energy infrastructure, from IoT devices, from the vehicle usage, from digital payments infrastructure, because today a significant portion of mobility payments happen through digital payments infrastructure. A significant portion of mobility has started moving towards ONDC, especially on the cargo side, as well as some part of the passenger mobility. When you combine all of this knowledge that you can get through data, you need AI to be able to tell you what kind of underwriting do you need to do, what kind of risk controls you need to put, how much to collect, is that an intention versus ability to pay kind of an issue. How do you look at breakages for the vehicle, breakages for the person itself from a health perspective, and so on and so forth, and adapt your systems accordingly. And that's where AI actually comes into picture from this as a real use case to solve for something deeper from a financial inclusion perspective. And AI for the sake of AI doesn't mean anything, right? So replacing human callers with bots doesn't mean anything, because a driver doesn't even pick a human call. So you're expecting him to pick a bot call is just a fancy thing to do, right? But the real work is in terms of how do you make his life far more better, how do you make his payments and his cash flows far more better using AI as the ability to understand data better and give you insights.
Right. So yeah, you're right. This is what you mentioned in the morning, that whereas other financiers are busy with KYC, know your customer. Your focus is understand your customer,
Correct.
UYC.
So
It's a very nice way of saying how you are going to fundamentally be different. So it's not just knowing who your customer is, to understanding what your customer needs are. Amazing. Anyways, no, that's been very, very helpful. This is a time where I throw an opportunity and say, hey, I've been questioning and throwing questions at you, but if there's something that you'd like to throw back at me and understand a little bit about us and how we look at this, we welcome that question.
So Kunal, what I have been very interested in, and especially I've been following you and Advantage for quite some time. I also attended one of your recent events, annual events, so to say, and I did mention to you saying that I didn't see such a huge uh, camaraderie slash partnership kind of a view that your investee companies had towards you and your team? And how did you kind of build that culture of almost being a semi operator of sorts in terms of helping founders build businesses rather than just being a person who adds or cuts a check, so to say?
No, no. Thank you, Sandeep, for coming for that event and adding value to it. I think as a fund, you'd appreciate that we are all been operators ourselves, so we are not career VCs. Um, so having been an operator, we've been on the other side of the table. So we understand that the real value of investing actually starts once the capital just comes in. And that's why we specialize in pre-product, pre-revenue, 0 to 1 journey. Because that's when you really build the foundation that's required on which you can build a phenomenal business. So that is the culture that sort of we've built. So for us, investing is not about just capital deployment. It's about bringing together founders who share a common passion, um, and are looking at fundamentally revolutionizing a singular industry, which in this our case is the mobility sector. And we know that there is so much that needs to be done, whether it's shared mobility, logistics, in the auto aftermarket space, or in the energy transition that we're building, that we are building an ecosystem of a portfolio of companies that are complementary with each other. So it's the founders that when they come together, they start living and feeding off each other's energy, start contributing to each other's success. And I think after having made about 32 investments in the same space, having created 9 category leaders, I think it is that infectious need for working and supporting each other is what you experienced that day. And now that we are investing and Exponent One is actually our first investment that we're making from our third fund. So we're hoping to add another 15 to 18 portfolio companies in that ecosystem. So hopefully the value of that ecosystem will keep compounding, and that's what we are super excited about.
Adding one more question to that as a corollary, do you see that a lot more sector focused, specialized funds are the way forward in the investing world than being generic spray and pray kind of approach of investing?
I think, well, historically, if you were to look at empirical data, sector focused funds of sub $100 million have typically outperformed larger funds or funds which don't have. And the reason for that is that if you're sector focused, you're not driven by hype or FOMO. You are keeping your heads down and you're learning about what are the opportunities in a specific sector and investing ahead of the curve. Sector agnostic funds, to a large extent, tend to come in once that hype cycle is well into its J curve. So that is the key difference. And we've seen a proliferation of sector focused funds in India now. We're probably the only mobility fund, but we've seen climate funds or consumer funds or deep tech funds or defense funds. And that's great because ultimately that's the only way you can compete with the larger funds is by saying, look, capital for us is just one of many things that we bring to the table, whether it's the understanding of the domain, whether we bring in strategic LPs who come from that sector, or we bring in a portfolio of companies of complementary businesses. So I'm hoping that we will see, but I think ultimately there is a need for all sorts of funds, whether they are early stage, sector focused, or mid stage or late stage sector agnostic. So that's great. Anyway, Sandeep, thank you so much.
Thanks, Kunal.
Thanks a lot. And thank you for joining us on Driven. What stands out from this conversation is the depth of perspective that you bring from asset management, fleet operations to EV financing. And now I look forward to working with you next many years to building Exponent One. As the EV system matures, leaders like Sandeep, who have operated at scale and understand both risk and opportunity, will play a critical role in shaping how this transition unfolds. Thank you again for tuning in to Driven, the Advantage podcast. If you find this conversation valuable, please do subscribe and share and join us as we continue to speak with founders who are fundamentally making a difference in the mobility and EV systems. Until next time, stay driven and thank you.